Well, good afternoon. I think all of us here are friends of UCT, and it is in that capacity that I welcome you in my capacity as president of the Legacy Society. I'll have a little more to say about that at the end. But for the moment, welcome to all of you. Vice Chancellor I see is here. There are many alumni. There are many friends of UCT. And great to have last year's Legacy Society lecturer, Trevor Manuel, with us today. It is a wonderful event, this annual lecture, and we are particularly pleased to have Justice Owen Rodgers give us the lecture today. He has been on the bench for a good number of years, and he's now been elevated to Johannesburg to the Constitutional Court. And we hope he will enjoy his few years there. His career at UCT was nothing but stellar. And of course, I have a particular prejudice in his favor because he took a year out of law studies to do an honors degree in classics. So he's actually an educated lawyer as well. There are many, many other aspects to Owen's career, and I'm not going to bore you with a recital of them. Merely to say how pleased I am that he's here to talk to us on a subject that I think we will all find fascinating. Owen, over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Hugh, and thank you very much for the honor of being invited to address this occasion, and particularly as I follow in the footsteps of many more illustrious speakers in the past. I'm going to show a few slides, but they are not necessary to follow what I'm going to say. They are just there perhaps to stop you falling asleep on a warm summer afternoon. If I were to ask you to name South African mass treason trials, you might mention 3 apartheid-era trials. The first Pretoria treason trial of 1958 to 1961, in which, at least to start with, 156 people were charged. The second Pretoria or Rivonia treason trial of 1963 and 4, in which 10 people were charged, and the Delmas treason trial of 1985 to 1988, in which 22 people were charged. But about 60 years before the first of those trials, there was another mass treason trial in South Africa. Now largely forgotten, this trial had the world agog at the time. And the events played a not insignificant part in the way South African politics unfolded in succeeding decades. The trial I have in mind is one in which 63 people faced treason charges in Pretoria. 2 of these men directly or indirectly gave birth to institutes which still form part of this university. Several others were founders of firms which grant bursaries to law students, including students from this university. And the names of 2 villains of the piece, though they did not stand trial in South Africa, were, until not so long ago, strongly associated with the name of this university. So you may by now have guessed that I'm talking about the events connected with the Jameson raid, a plot hatched by Cecil John Rhodes and Leander Starr Jameson. In the middle of the 19th century, the Dutch inhabitants of the Cape Colony who trekked inland established 2 republics, the Orange Free State and the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek or Transvaal. The Free State kept fairly affable relations with Britain, the Transvaal less so. But Britain, in truth, was not very interested in the dozy pastoral world of the Transvaal until about 1886, when the gold reef was discovered. This brought many outsiders to the Transvaal, the so-called Uitlanders, and Johannesburg mushroomed. Most of the Uitlanders were British citizens from the Cape, Natal, other British colonies, and from England itself. At that time, Paul Kruger was the president of the Transvaal. A liberal franchise law which was fine at a time when nobody wanted to become a Transvaal citizen, was incrementally restricted to stop the original Dutch settlers from being swamped. Political agitation from the Uitlanders intensified over the period 1886 to 1895. Within a few years of the discovery of the reef, a bankrupt Transvaal fiscus was overflowing with money generated by the industrial activity of the newcomers. The Uitlanders' grievances focused on corrupt and inefficient government, what nowadays we might call state capture among them, including the granting of monopolies and concessions to cronies who had Kruger's ear. The Uitlanders also complained of their inability to vote. To what extent they really wanted the vote has been debated. They were financial cormorants who were unlikely to want to give up their British citizenship. They had come to the Transvaal to make money and then to leave it. All the same, this complaint, no taxation without representation, remained at the forefront. In its lawful form, the agitation was pursued by an Uitlander organization called the National Union, established in August 1892. But by the middle of 1895, the Uitlander leaders were pessimistic about ever getting redress from the Kruger government. And it was at around this time that an unlawful plot was hatched outside of the Transvaal by Rhodes, Jamison, and several others, including the mining engineer John Jays Hammond, who is the subject of Charles van Onsselin's 2017 book, The Cowboy Capitalist. Rhodes was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, a distinctly odd thing to have him in that capacity conspiring to bring revolution to the Transvaal. His close friend Jamison was the administrator of what was then called Matabele land for Rhodes's chartered company. Hammond was the highest earning mining engineer in the world, working for Rhodes's Johannesburg gold mining interests under the name of the company Goldfields. This plan involved a worked-up insurrection in Johannesburg, which would then be supported by a force which Jamison would have on the border and which would cross over into the Transvaal to come to the aid, as it was put, of the Johannesburg rebels. This plot could not work without the involvement of some leading Transvaal Uitlanders. In addition to Hammond, Rhodes's brother Frank, a military man, was given a cover position with Goldfields in Johannesburg. Several other Johannesburgers were drawn into the plot. They included the lawyer Charles Leonard, who was at that time chairperson of the National Union and the top earning attorney in Johannesburg, and two top mining industrialists, Lionel Phillips of the mining house Eckstein & Co., colloquially known as Corner House, and George Farrar, who headed up the East Rand Mining Company. Also in the know were two other prominent Johannesburg figures, who I'll mention at the end of this talk: Percy Fitzpatrick, also a Corner House man, and Abe Bailey, a stockbroker and Rhodes confidant. The phony Johannesburg Revolution was scheduled for Boxing Day. During a final preparatory trip to Johannesburg in November of 1895, Jamison asked the ringleaders for a letter which he could show if after the event he was asked to explain why he had crossed into the Transvaal. And thus it was that he was given, undated, a signed letter, a so-called letter of invitation, which would say that the Johannesburg residents were in a terrible state and would Jamison come to their aid. The idea was that he would date it when the revolution started, and then he would cross over. Now, Jamison and his force were ready at the border well before the 26th of December. But in Johannesburg, things were going behind. The logistics of getting weapons into the Transvaal was taking longer than expected. Another problem was that in mid-December, rumors reached Johannesburg that when Jamison arrived in the Transvaal and succeeded, as they all assumed he would, he was going to raise the Union Jack, whereas a lot of the Uitlanders were talking to their friends on the basis that there'd be regime change, but still a republic. So as a result, Charles Leonard, whose story is very interesting, but I won't be able to say more about him today. He was sent down to Cape Town to talk to Rhodes to thrash this out and also to secure a postponement of the revolution. And he was still in Cape Town when things went awry, and he never returned to the Transvaal to face the music and was subsequently thought to have been guilty of cowardice, but for many reasons that is an unfair judgment. But although telegrams flew between Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Mafeking, Jameson just thought the Johannesburgers were in a funk, and that all they needed to prompt them into action was for him to cross over. And he wasn't going to be denied his moment of glory. And so on the night of the 29th of December, even though there was no revolution yet in place in Johannesburg, he and his force crossed over and made for Johannesburg. When news of this reached the ringleaders in Johannesburg, they were absolutely appalled. Some of them were for sending out men to try to help Jameson, though it's doubtful whether they could have got to him in time to save him. But for political and other reasons, they stayed their hand, and Jameson was quickly defeated by the Boer commanders. What the ringleaders in Johannesburg did do was to hastily throw together an organization which they called the Reform Committee. And they recruited many of the leading lights of Johannesburg onto this committee. And the 63 people who subsequently stood trial were all the leading members of the Reform Committee. Many of these reformers, as they were called at the time, were actually ignorant of the original plot. They joined the committee on the understanding that its function was partly to protect Johannesburg, because it was expected that the Boer commanders would be absolutely enraged by a perceived attempt on their country and would actually come and attack Johannesburg. And the other function they thought was to parley with the Kruger government to try to diffuse the powder keg. But they soon probably discovered that there was something more sinister afoot. That, by the way, is the sort of scene that was taking place during these days outside the Goldfields building, where people would gather to hear word from the leaders, and were they going out to help Jameson or weren't they? Now, the outstanding attorney, W.H.S. Bell, who founded and for many years edited the Cape Law Journal, which later became the South African Law Journal, still South Africa's premier law journal. He was one of these leading lights invited to join the Reform Committee. In his reminiscences, he describes going to the Goldfields building to join the Reform Committee. He asked what he had to pay to be a member, and he was told it was free. So inside he went to find out what was going on, and it soon dawned on him that all was not well. He discovered that seditious speeches were being made, not to an audience, but to stenographers. And he writes in his memoirs, "Half an hour was sufficient to convince me that we were all in for high treason, and that I had been fooled into joining a movement with which I was not in sympathy." Jameson and his troops were taken prisoner, but disastrously, Jameson had brought this letter of invitation with him in his dispatch box, and he had falsely dated it on the 29th of December, even though he had not got any word from Johannesburg that his aid was in fact needed. After negotiations with the British government, the Transvaal extradited Jameson and his officers to Britain to stand charges under separate statutory law in the Old Bailey, where they received modest sentences. Rhodes and Joseph Chamberlain, the hawkish colonial secretary, were cleared in a whitewash British select parliamentary inquiry. But in Johannesburg, Kruger's government was intent on extracting a full price from the Johannesburg men. Because they resided in the Transvaal, they were all amenable to the Transvaal's laws on treason. Since the letter of invitation had fallen into the hands of the Transvaal authorities, the prosecution team had 5 names to start with: Hammond, Phillips, Farrar, Charles Leonard, and Frank Rhodes. Leonard, however, had been on his urgent mission to Cape Town and never returned. The Transvaal authorities were not willing to stop at the 4 people who had signed the letter of invitation. They were aware of the existence of the Reform Committee and of some of its activities, including speeches that were being made, and all the reform men were therefore arrested, and men they all were at that time, and charged with treason. These naturally included, among others, Percy Fitzpatrick, A. Bailey, and the unfortunate W.H.S. Bell. The arrests of the Reform Committee members actually took place in a remarkably civilized fashion. The ZARPs, as they were called, the South African police, arrived at the Rand Club, which is where Reform Committee men were expected to be found at any time when meals were to be eaten or drinks to be drunk, and arrested those who were present. They were permitted to have a last drink, to buy cigars, and to send out notes. Other Reform Committee members, learning of the arrest of their comrades, came to the Rand Club to present themselves for arrest. One such man was Bill, who was allowed to use a detective's cart to go home and fetch a pillow and other provisions before being taken to the Pretoria prison. Things were not so pleasant when they got to Pretoria. They were marched up in two groups to the Pretoria prison through jeering crowds who pelted them with missiles. And life for the awaiting trial prisoners was no bed of roses. But after a time, they were allowed to receive food and cigars from the Pretoria Club. The Reverend H.J. Bates, a Baptist minister in Pretoria, knew some of the arrested men and got permission to visit them. He described the jail as, quote, a filthy hole and alive with vermin. A few days after the arrest, he was allowed to conduct a holy service there. Just as the service was about to start, it dawned on him that he had forgotten to bring his hymn book. One of the prisoners scuttled off and returned with a miniature Hymns Ancient and Modern, which Anglicans among you will recognize. And as the Reverend Minister and his imprisoned flock were wondering what hymn they might all know, his eyes fell upon one which he immediately announced as their opening song, "O Happy Band of Pilgrims." All the suspects were eventually released on bail pending trial. There was a preparatory examination before a magistrate. Kruger's state attorney and lead prosecutor was Herman Koster, a 30-year-old Hollander who had moved to the Transvaal with idealistic fervor for spreading Dutch civilization. He was a high-minded young man and ultimately a tragic figure. He summoned a large number of people to testify at the preparatory examination, but most of the English-speaking witnesses who could have given important information were struck by remarkable forgetfulness. The witnesses from the Standard Bank, for example, where the conspirators kept their funds, and journalists from the pro-Uitlander newspaper, The Star. Koster had got wind of draft proclamations which The Star had printed for the Reform Committee, but none of the newspaper's witnesses, all with fine-sounding English surnames, could remember the detail of the contents or of the all-important information about whose names appeared at the foot of these proclamations. They never went into mass print, and the proofs were not to be found, much to the relief of the accused. One of the draft proclamations surfaced after the Boer War. It was a document proclaiming a provisional government with Charles Leonard as president, Phillips Farrar and attorney E.P. Solomon as vice presidents, and the rest of the Reform Committee as members of the provisional government. The other proclamation apparently identified portfolios in the provisional government and Charles Leonard's older brother James, a top advocate, as the new Chief Justice. At the preparatory inquiry and subsequent trial, all the accused had as their lead counsel John Wessels, an outstanding jurist who, despite his surname, was a man whose sympathies lay with the Uitlanders. The treason indictment was drafted by one of Koster's junior counsel, Fritz Krause. Oh, that's not Fritz Krause. So we'll have to, maybe that's also not Fritz Krause. All right, well, we'll just have to leave things there for the moment. And we've even lost Wessels. All right. Krause, a wonderful character, this is now the junior prosecutor who drafted the indictment, eventually became judge president of the Orange Free State Division in 1933, was the last survivor of the 1896 treason trial. He died in August 1959 at the age of 91. In an interview shortly before his death, he noted with satisfaction and a smile that the pugnacious vessels had not been able to find any legal fault with the treason indictment Krause had drafted in 1896. He made this remark at a time when the many legitimate objections raised by Sidney Kentridge against the state's rambling indictment against the 1958 treason trialists were fresh in legal minds. The selection of a judge presented a dilemma for Kruger's government. 3 of the judges, including the Chief Justice, John Gilbert Kotzer, had advised the government during the crisis and so could not preside. The remaining 2 judges were thought not to be reliably pro-government. Kotzer had been appointed as the Transvaal's first judge in 1877 at the tender age of 27. The English novelist Anthony Trollope, who traveled through South Africa in that year, met him, famously remarking, "One expects a judge to be reverent with years, but this was hardly more than a boy judge." Kotzer was not, though, the youngest judge ever to be appointed in South Africa. That honor goes to the man Kruger's government recruited from the Free State to preside at the treason trial, Reinhold Gregorowski. This is him, obviously, as a significantly older man. He was first appointed as a judge in the Free State in 1881 at the age of 24. By the time of the treason trial, he was only 40, which makes him quite venerable for a pioneer country with a lot of young, mainly men. He was an able lawyer, and after the Boer War, he had a distinguished career as a barrister and judge. But in 1896, Kruger's motives for selecting him were questioned, at least by the Uitlanders. He was thought to be a severe criminal trial judge, except where the accused was a Boer. While he was still in Bloemfontein, he was rumored to have openly expressed the wish to get this trial so that he could give the reformers what for. Percy Fitzpatrick peddled the story that when he arrived in Pretoria, Gregorowski asked some of his Pretoria colleagues whether they might be able to lend him a black cap, which would have to be donned if a death sentence was passed. His visage did not allay the concerns of those inclined to judge by appearances. Lionel Phillips's wife said of Gregorowski that, quote, "with his evil hawk-like face, he seemed the very personification of cruelty and malice." That some of the accused, the ringleaders in particular, might get the death sentence was widely recognized. Not long after the conclusion of the preliminary examination, one of the accused got an alarming letter warning him that there was a Boer faction determined to see the signatories of the letter of invitation hanged. To lend this envisaged execution greater piquancy, they had apparently, according to the letter writer, purchased and brought to Pretoria the beam from which 5 Cape Dutchmen had been hanged at Slagtersneck in Somerset East in 1816. This was an event etched deep into the psyche of those who had trekked north in the 1830s. In truth, though, the timbers from the gallows in Somerset East had been built into a farmhouse in that area and were eventually rediscovered in the derelict house in 1947. But it is quite plausible that a Boer faction had this idea. The indictment against the accused charged them with doing various acts with hostile intent to disturb, injure, or endanger the independence of the Republic. The acts included conspiring with Jameson, providing him with information, keeping armed forces ready to go to his aid, holding seditious meetings to induce Johannesburgers to help Jameson, causing weapons and ammunition to be distributed, and carrying out in Johannesburg the functions and powers properly belonging to a government, to the extent even that the government officials had been forced to vacate Johannesburg. The trial was set to start before a jury on 24 April 1896. In the days preceding the trial, there were discussions between Coster and Wessels, as a result of which the 4 ringleaders, the signatories to that letter of invitation, Phillips, Farrar, Hammond, and Frank Rhodes, agreed to plead guilty to the most serious charge of high treason on the basis that Coster would then accept from the rank and file accused a plea of guilty to lesser charges, with the qualification also that the rank and file's actions were without hostile intent to injure or endanger the Republic's independence. This plea agreement was reached after Costa revealed his possession of a rich trove of telegrams, which had also foolishly been carried into the Transvaal as part of Jamieson's papers, and which revealed the planning of the conspiracy. There's Fritz Krause, also much older. When the court convened in April 1896, it boasted a glittering array of talent, legal and otherwise. Present were 3 future Chief Justices of the Union of South Africa, James Rose Ennis, who was there holding a watching brief for the British High Commissioner, John Wessels, the lead defense counsel, and Japie de Villiers, one of the defense juniors. Another de facto defense counsel, though he was not an admitted advocate in the Transvaal, was Richard Solomon from the Cape. He later served as Attorney General in the Cape and was also the first Attorney General of the Transvaal colony following the Boer War. One of the other accused present on that day was James Leonard, widely regarded as the best advocate of his era. Another accused, the attorney E.P. Solomon, who was Richard Solomon's older brother, was later to become a Minister of Public Works in Louis Botha's first cabinet when the Transvaal gained responsible government in 1907. Yet another accused, Henry Hull, served in the 1907 Transvaal cabinet as finance minister and became the union's first finance minister in 1910. There was Mr. Bell, the founder and longtime editor of the journal that remains South Africa's leading law journal, and I should say, the eponymous Mr. Bell, who established the firm which Johannesburg people at least might remember, which became Bell, Dewar and Hall. The presiding judge, Reinhold Gregorowski, later had a distinguished career as a judge, even if he did not rise to the heights of some of the others. This mass picture, by the way, of some of the accused, in the back row to the right, you'll see a fellow peeping through wearing a boater. That is Henry Hull. He was something of a prankster, although he became finance minister. It's not only in those days that we had pranksters as finance ministers. E.P. Solomon, as we look at it, is immediately to the left of Hull, and seated in the left on the step, on the far left is the unfortunate W.H.S. Bell. The prosecutor, Herman Costa, might have gone on to greater things, were it not for an ironic but tragic twist of fate. When the war broke out, he joined the Hollander Corps to fight for the Boers. And they saw action, one of the early battles of the Boer War in Natal at Elandslaagte. Fighting on the other side were some members of the Reform Committee, including Charles Mullins. And in that battle at Elandslaagte, Costa lost his life, bravely trying to rally his men, while Charles Mullins, fighting for the Imperial Light Horse, won a Victoria Cross for his bravery. Following the plea agreement, Wessel's principal object at this trial was to avoid the death sentence for the 4 ringleaders. The trial was billed in the local press as the most important criminal case which had ever become before a law court in South Africa. The only building in Pretoria large enough to accommodate the necessary participants and throngs of spectators was the Market Hall, which was fitted out as a temporary court. The proceedings were conducted in Dutch, with everything translated into English. The Market Hall, with its barrel roof, had abominable acoustics. Mrs. Phillips wrote that the accused were seated so far away from the judge and the lawyers that they could hardly hear a thing. On the first day, the agreed pleas were entered on behalf of the accused. On the next day, Costa led largely uncontested evidence about the Reform Committee's negotiations with the government deputation and about the telegrams found in Jamieson's dispatch box. Costa then blandly asked the judge to punish the accused in accordance with Roman Dutch law, taking into consideration the seriousness of the crimes they had committed. This was, in effect, though very understated, a request for the death sentence on the 4 ringleaders. After Costa was done, Wessels handed up and read to the court a lengthy statement in mitigation prepared on behalf of the 4 ringleaders and a separate shorter statement on behalf of the rank and file prisoners. that the accused could put in statements of explanation was part of the plea agreement. The ringleaders' statement placed their conduct in the context of legitimate political grievances and also emphasized their last-minute attempts to stop Jamieson from crossing the border. After an adjournment, Wessels began his 2-hour argument. There were technical arguments as to whether the common law of treason still applied or whether it had been replaced by a statutory offence, under which the highest punishment would have been a fine of £500 and banishment. For the rest, Wessels tried to play down the gravity of the ringleader's conduct. In the light of facts that later emerged, his factual submissions, however compelling they may have seemed at the time, are almost comical. The ringleaders, Wessels said, were men of influence and intellect and possessed immense wealth in the country. Would they, he asked rhetorically, have been acting according to the dictates of common sense by conspiring with Rhodes's chartered company to invade the Transvaal, seeing that their interests were anything but identical? The name of Cecil John Rhodes, he said, was enough to turn the people of Johannesburg against any movement with which he was connected. But in fact, that is precisely what the ringleaders had conspired to do. Wessels' next bull point was that the smallness of the force with which Jamieson made his incursion showed that no real violence was intended. It was sufficient to show, he said, that the accused had no hostile intent toward the Republic's independence. Again, a rhetorical question from the pugnacious defense advocate, quote, was it likely for one moment that men such as the accused, men of common sense, would dream of assailing the Republic or causing it to be assailed with a small force of men such as that which accompanied Jamieson? Certainly not. The affair was simply intended to attract attention to the grievances of the Uitlanders and to obtain redress. But it was indeed Jamieson's intention to assail the Republic, although the Johannesburg conspirators had hoped that they might achieve their coup bloodlessly. But Wessels' submission overlooked 2 facts of which we may assume him to have been ignorant. The first was that because of poor preparation and attrition due to delay, Jamieson's force was much smaller by the time he crossed the border than it was meant to have been. It was meant to have been 1,500, but he eventually crossed with fewer than 500. Second, Jamieson grossly underestimated the fighting capacity of the Boer commandos. He once remarked that he would need only 500 men armed with sjamboks to drive the Boers out of the Transvaal. When he visited Johannesburg in November, the Star's editor, Fred Hamilton, warned Jamieson and Frank Rhodes that they would meet much stronger resistance than they were apparently expecting. Jamieson retorted disdainfully, I shall get through as easily as a knife cuts butter. His Maxim machine guns, he said, would draw a zone of lead a mile each side of his column, and no Boer would be able to live in it. In fact, the Boers, firing accurately from well-chosen cover, easily halted and then defeated Jamieson's men. Continuing in a similar vein, Wessels told Gregorowski that if the accused had intended to assail the independence of the Transvaal, they could easily have imported 25,000 rifles instead of only 2.5, and armed 25,000 men to take control of the railways and the town. Again, Wessels was presumably not told by his clients that Hammond was meant to have organized the smuggling in of 5,000 rifles, and that thousands more were meant to have been made available by one part of the plot, which was to seize control of the arsenal in Pretoria. That his well-to-do clients had executed their planned revolution with almost farcical incompetence may not have been a strong argument, but it would have been much closer to the truth. Wessels' address had an electrifying effect on Costa, much to the dismay of the accused and their legal team. James Rose Innes reported to the High Commissioner that Costa made a very vehement speech in which he asked the judge to sentence the ringleaders to death. It was contrary to the practice of the colonial courts, and so James Rose Innes understood the Transvaal courts, for a prosecutor to oppose an appeal to mercy. Innes found Costa's vehemence all the more inexplicable because until then he had conducted the prosecution with great dignity and fairness. More lurid accounts in the press described how Costa strode up and down the court, shouting and brandishing his arms in a state of uncontrollable excitement and repeatedly uttering the phrase, hangen by de nek. Costa's impassioned plea for harsh punishment, while not very British, was not unknown in continental Europe, but a different explanation for Costa's change of tone has been offered. It is claimed that there was an understanding between Costa and Wessels that the question whether the common law punishment for treason still applied would not be argued, but would be left to the judge. It was also implicit in the plea understanding, so it has been suggested, that the statement that would be put in by the ringleaders would not be inconsistent with their plea of guilty. The content of the ringleader's statement that Wessels had read out and the submissions that Wessels then made on the strength of it had blindsided the idealistic young prosecutor. He had been willing not to press for the harshest punishment, but he had wanted a clear message to go out to the world that there had been a British imperialist plot in which Uitlander leaders in Johannesburg were implicated. The ringleader's statement had diluted and fudged the message, hence Costa's impassioned reply. Although many of the Boers wanted the ringleaders to be executed, Judge Gregorowski, Costa, and Kruger perhaps anticipated that the main advantage of a heavy sentence was the global approval Kruger would win by a magnanimous show of mercy. In imposing the death sentence, Gregorowski expressed the wish that the president and his government would display magnanimity. Confident perhaps that this would be done, Gregorowski publicly undercut the grudging reference to clemency by adding that in any other country, the condemned men would not have a claim on the government's mercy. Costa later remarked that the ringleaders had as much chance of being hanged as he himself. Apart from the political kudos which Kruger could score, the painful truth is that in the Transvaal, race played an important part in whether a death sentence was carried out. In his closing argument, Wessels submitted that the Afrikaners were not a bloodthirsty or vindictive people, and that capital punishment was, quote, very seldom carried out in this country against a white man. According to Gregorowski, the execution of a white person was practically unheard of in the Republic. The executive always commuted the sentence of white offenders, and only black people underwent the extreme penalty. And so it was that within 24 hours, the death sentence was commuted. In fairness to Gregorowski, capital punishment for high treason was not out of keeping with the morality of the day. And there is an interesting modern perspective also on this. You may or may not know that nowadays, if, for example, there's a shootout between an armed gang and the police, and a police officer happens to shoot one of the members of the gang, and that criminal dies, the criminal's compatriots can all be charged with murder of their compatriot on the footing that they had taken the risk that people might die in their enterprise and had been reckless as to whether that would happen, the famous dolus eventualis of the Oscar Pistorius case. Now, the ringleaders in the Jameson raid case must have known that there was a possibility that people would die in conflict between Jameson's men and the Boer commanders. And in fact, people did die. About 30 of Jameson's own men died and 1 or 2 from the Boers. So the ringleaders could all have faced murder charges, at least under the laws we understand it, and then the death sentence in the Transvaal would have been mandatory. The ringleader's punishment was replaced with 15 years imprisonment. The rest of the accused had already been sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. There were pleas for further clemency, both from inside and out, and eventually all the accused, save for 2 who held out, had been released by the end of May. The tedium of jail life was relieved by a visit from a 60-year-old Samuel Clemens, better known by his pen name Mark Twain. He told the men that prison life, from some points of view, was an ideal existence. He instanced the great works of literature written by Bunyan and Cervantes in prison. The dream of his life, he said, had been to get incarcerated, but whenever I have committed anything, there have never been any witnesses except myself, and my reputation for veracity was not sufficient to get me convicted without corroborating evidence. There was no place, he said, where a man could secure such uninterrupted quiet as in jail. He was sure that the longer they stayed there, the more the charm would grow on them. Although the prisoners were not inclined to view their incarceration in that philosophical light, the position was so plain, Twain declared, that in his forthcoming interview with Kruger, he would endeavor to have their sentences lengthened. Another distraction dreamt up by Charlie Mullins, who won his Victoria Cross a few years later, was to get his fellow prisoners to make sketches of pigs. The resultant artworks have been said to portray an outstanding poverty of talent. But the explanation was that Mullins insisted that his artists should work blindfolded. Why a pig? Because the prisoners had encouraged Johannesburg to lay down their arms on their understanding that Kruger's government would then not take harsh action against them. This was the pig they had bought in the poke, which is how the collection of sketches was later published under the title Showing Our Ideas of the Pig We Bought in a Poke from the Government of the So-Called Republic. This is a lighter side of the affair, but there is a more serious side. We name this episode in history after Jameson, but it could never have happened but for the buy-in of leading Johannesburg Uitlanders. The event cast a long shadow over South African history. Paul Kruger was elderly, and in the most recent presidential election before the Jameson raid, he had only slightly beaten the more enlightened Piet Joubert as a candidate for the presidency. If the Uitlanders had bided their time, the Transvaal Republic might have become more liberal, with a growing rapprochement between the Dutch and the English inhabitants. Instead, the failed conspiracy polarized Dutch and English, not only in the two Boer republics, but in the whole of South Africa. Kruger won the next presidential election, as often happens in such circumstances, by a landslide. He was convinced that Britain had always intended to take over, and he started a massive program of rearmament. And Joseph Chamberlain was smarting from the bungle and looking for any excuse to redress what he thought had been a defeat as a result of this whole incident. One commentator described life in the Transvaal from 1896 to 1899 as life on the brink of a volcano. Perhaps the Boer War would have happened anyway, but the Jameson raid made it certain. When war broke out in October 1899, it brought misery to hundreds and thousands of black and white men and women. Following the British victory, the two Boer republics became British colonies with an embittered and increasingly nationalistic Afrikaner population. The existence of 4 British colonies paved the way to the Union of South Africa in 1910 and to decades of Afrikaner government. But for the actions of the Johannesburg conspirators, war with Britain may not have happened. The Boer republics may have remained independent. We may not have had the Union. At least in the Cape and perhaps in Natal, race relations may have followed a different trajectory. And here, by race relations, I don't mean race relations as the people I have been talking about would have understood it, between the English and the Dutch, but relations between the black and white inhabitants of the country. We will never know the counterfactual, but cause and effect are not always proportional. Seemingly insignificant events can have far-reaching consequences. Maybe South Africa's forgotten treason trial is an example. Since this is a Legacy Society lecture, it is perhaps fitting that I end by identifying the 2 accused who are associated with institutes at this university. There is the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology, founded in 1960 by Cecily Niven. She was Percy Fitzpatrick's daughter and was married to Jack Niven, the son of one of Percy's co-accused, Andrew Mackie Niven. The founding of the institute was made possible by wealth inherited from her father. The other institute, now called the Center for Conflict Resolution, was established in 1968 as the A. Bailey Institute for Interracial Studies, with funds provided by the A. Bailey Trust. If Costa had known what we know now about the involvement of Fitzpatrick and Bailey in the plot, they would have been among the ringleaders sentenced to death. But a criminal conviction is no obstacle to a legacy. Thank you.
Owen, thank you very, very much indeed. There's now an opportunity for questions. We'll take such questions as there may be. Who would like to start with questions? Justice Sachs?
This is prearranged with Owen. He was surprised to get a letter from me commenting on his book or the presentation he'd made, that I was even interested in the Forgotten Treason trial. I was connected with the Unforgotten Treason trial, and I thought I would liaise and provide him information on that. I discovered I got the trial wrong, the wrong trial. But when I was researching in England for my PhD, I was very interested in the way the law had been used, usually through martial law, to imprison people who were rebelling against the particular regime at particular time. And I came across the book by Charles Bell, who, age of 26, I think, became editor of the Cape Law Journal. And that became a very central source for me in writing my dissertation on the administration of justice in racially stratified society. And the part that amused me most in his autobiography was when he was imprisoned as part and parcel of the processes we've just heard. His colleagues who were imprisoned were British gentlemen. They were extremely offended that they were being treated so roughly by these crude Boers. And they complained, and the press in England blew it up. It was worse than the Black Hole of Calcutta that we used to read about in school. And he commented that one of the prisoners, the only injuries that the prisoner suffered was getting sunburn, playing marbles. If I could just comment, it's really just a little counterpoint to what Owen's been saying. Karl Marx very famously said once, when Louis Bonaparte was declared emperor of France and I think of Mexico, history repeats itself, first at the level of tragedy, then at the level of farce. Here, history repeated itself first at the level of farce and later on at Ravoni at the level of tragedy.
Thank you. There's a hand in the middle, first with a mask. Do you want to take that as a question or a rhetorical one?
I'm not really an historian or a politician. So I research just as a matter of interest. What I spoke today is just a small part of something I researched and wrote a book about after I read Van Onslo's book about Hammond, the cowboy capitalist. I just saw occasional names of lawyers in Hammond's book, and I thought, what's this about lawyers apparently getting involved in treason? They seemed so. I thought maybe I'd write an article in the Law Journal. Eventually, it mushroomed into a not best-selling book. But and one of the reasons why I would never have attracted one of the more recent political treason trials is that requires a whole knowledge of history and politics and a much vaster literature than I would have been capable of handling, what had the time to handle, even if I had the ability. So no, I won't hazard an answer to your question, except I think very likely not, either by the Chinese or and definitely not by the British. I might be.
There's a question right at the back. I think just wait until the mic comes to you so that we can hear.
Thank you. It's not a question, it's a comment, really. I was particularly interested in the reference to E.P. Solomon and his brother Richard, who were the brothers of my great-great-grandmother, and incidentally were born in the little Free State village of Philippolis, those two brothers.
They are also related, by the way, to Peter Solomon, who is a senior advocate in Johannesburg and a great expert in tax. I'm not sure if he's the son or down a, no.
I just wanted to say, I read a book called The First South African, which was a story about Sir Percy Fitzpatrick. And I've tried to find a copy now, and I can't find it anywhere, but it's a book I'd recommend. And of course, it goes into his involvement in the treason trial, but of course, much else as well, and Jock of the Bushveld comes out of it. But it's a book I'd recommend. If anybody can find a copy, I'd like to get another copy.
He actually wrote a book which Chamberlain was very keen to have published when Kruger and was Milner, who were talking in Bloemfontein in 1899 to try and avert the war, because Percy Fitzpatrick had written a book. I'm not sure what it was. It was something that the Transvaal conspiracy. It was about the Jameson raid and the history. It was designed to sway British public opinion in favor of the war, and apparently it succeeded. I'm aware of the book you mentioned as well, but it's Fitzpatrick did write a book specifically directed at the history going up to about 1899, including in a big way the Jameson raid. Although strangely, I found in the sources that I read, I do not get the impression that any of the Reform Committee trialists were particularly anxious to boast of their involvement in it after the Boer War. One would, if one goes to our modern treason trials, one would wear it as a badge of honor that you were charged and convicted. I think the Reform Committee people in the British colonial environment following the Boer War were in fact slightly embarrassed, because there was a sentiment abroad in Britain and amongst British people who didn't live in the Transvaal that the Reform Committee people had not acted very courageously, that instead of folding, they should have fought for Jameson. And so I think for that reason, they didn't really want to talk about their involvement, which is why it's quite difficult to find information as to what each of them did. Some of this information, they eventually had to do individualized petitions to Kruger's government in order to get their prison sentences reduced. And if one spends enough time, as I tried to do, you can find their handwritten petitions in the archives in Pretoria. But even those, I think, only say as much as they have to say, and not always necessarily the truth.
Thank you so much, Justice Owen Rodgers, for today's lecture. I have one question. What are the 3 lessons that you would give to me as a young person that we can carry from this story that you shared with us today?
Well, if you're talking what might be a key lesson if you were a lawyer and you were approached to act for people like this, I think one of the key things that went wrong in this case for the defense was that the same legal team represented all 63 people, and their interests were not the same. There were some people who were had no involvement essentially in the case. There were some people who were in it boots and all. And I think the legal team was really not in a position to put forward the arguments that they could, because they took everybody was painted with the same brush. And not all of the Reform Committee people were happy with that either, but they didn't break ranks. So if you're talking at a legal level, it would be avoid conflicts of interest. I suppose if you're talking at a more political level, it will be the same old story that history gets written by the winners.
Well done. Thank you. Well,
Can I just ask two questions?
yes.
Can I ask two questions, please? Owen, has anything been published on the heritage that those Reform Committee members left that you mentioned at the start of your talk? You said a lot of them had given rise, and their families, and they had done tremendous things in South Africa. Has anything been published on that? And my second question is, the legal people involved in the case all seemed incredibly young. Today it would be, unlike yourself, today they would all be much older. What's changed?
At this time in 1895, the Transvaal it had a very young population because I'm now talking about the white population. The immigrants were young people looking to make money. A lot of them were men. They were unmarried men who weren't intending to settle there. It was a pioneer country, and I think it's a feature of pioneer countries that they tend to be young. Insofar as legal talent is concerned, the legal talent could have been drawn from, if you're talking about Southern Africa, from the Cape Colony or from Natal. And the work available in those colonies was not so great as to support a large independent legal community. So I don't know how many advocates there were in Cape Town in 1895, but I'd be surprised if it was more than 15. And it was hard to break into this. So people like Wessels and James Leonard went there because they saw opportunities, which perhaps weren't as available. James Leonard's actually not a good example because he was doing very well in Cape Town already. But Wessels, Kotze, people like that, I think saw opportunities which might come to them more slowly if they remained in Cape Town. Why? I personally think that they were in many ways remarkable people. The lawyers particularly, those are the ones I can make some assessment of. They were extraordinarily talented by any standards in any age. And how come they happened to be concentrated at that time in the Transvaal? I don't know. James Leonard once very modestly said that in 1895, there were in Johannesburg more brains to the square inch than in any other place in the world. Sorry, that was part of your question. Oh, a legacy and writings about them. There isn't anything substantial. I think Henry Hull, who was one of the attorneys who was in the Reform Committee and became the first finance minister in responsible government in the Transvaal and then in the Union, was a remarkable man and probably deserves a biography. I think the same is true of Fritz Krause, who was, although he was prosecuting for Kruger's government, was way ahead of his time in terms of being against the past laws, corporal punishment, capital punishment. He was a pioneer in terms of what one should try to do with prisons and the prison environment. He deserves an autobiography. James Rose Innes has published an autobiography, and as did Kotze. Unfortunately, Kotze's autobiography stops just before the Jameson raid. I'm not sure he was entirely happy with his role in it, so his pen got stuck at around that time.
Owen, may I please bring a personal note to this wonderful lecture of yours? Many years ago, my mother inherited a magnificent bookcase which had belonged to Dr. Jameson, and Cecil John Rhodes had filled it with magnificent first edition books. I was working in the law faculty at the time, and I didn't know who to give it to because I felt it had great significance in historical content. I knew of two places, Groote Schuur, which had once been the home of Cecil John Rhodes, and secondly, Glenara. I spoke to my mother, and she was quite happy to donate this bookcase, which had belonged to Dr. Jameson and had been confiscated from him after the aborted Jameson raid. It was full of the most magnificent books. And my mother had come by this through a personal friend of hers who had been a physician to Cecil John Rhodes. So I donated it to Glenara. And the books my mother agreed to donate to the Jagger Library. Sadly, a few years ago, I went in search of this bookcase and I could not find it. Dr. Stuart Saunders was the Vice Chancellor at the time when I donated it. And sadly, I have to add, the lot of those magnificent first edition, leather-bound, signed copies were lost in that big fire at the Jagger Library. So here endeth my personal contribution to your extremely interesting lecture, Owen. Thank you.
Right, one last comment.
A personal story too. I went to Jameson High, and that's a school in Gatuma, that was, and we stayed in Leander House, the girls, and the boys were in Star House. But unfortunately, I don't think we were really given much background to why it was called Leander Star Jameson. But yeah.
Just by the way, Leander Starr Jameson had a younger brother, Samuel, about whom I was able not to find out very much, but he was also one of the accused on the Reform Committee.
Well, very last question.
Justice, you mentioned that pioneer countries tend to have a lot of young people in power. And we can see clearly from the lecture that you've given what downsides they can come from having a lot of young people in power. But in your opinion, what are the upsides of having a lot of young people in power that can come with having a lot of young people in power?
Sorry, what is the upside of having young people?
Pioneer countries, organizations, and companies.
I would be a great supporter of it. I thought New Zealand did quite well recently. And I saw today the person who seems to be touted to take over from, what's her name? Yes. And he, if anything, looks younger than she does. And in fact, like a young Sean Pollock, it looked to me. Yes. And I wonder why we don't have more young leaders in this country. I don't know whether it's because the political structures involve sort of working your way up through grassroots organizations and getting more, getting more and more credibility. But I do feel that young people would have an energy that older politicians lack. Whether it would be good to have 24-year-old judges, I'm not so sure.
Well, it's my task to thank Owen on behalf of all of you. I'm going to a couple of commercials. The first is for his book, Lawyers in Turmoil. If you haven't read it, he said it's not yet been a bestseller. It should be. It's great fun reading, and will keep one awake when you can't get onto a computer because of load shedding. So, Lawyers in Turmoil is a great book and deals with the issues that he has been speaking to us today. I think it's been a wonderful lecture, full of erudition, full of wit and humor, and some lessons for us. The last slide with these footnotes about UCT of interest. A footnote first on the bookcase. It's in the Strubenhome in the College of Music, which I think is the only elegant room in the university that actually is a fitting place for that bookcase. So it is there. Oh, certainly it was there 7 years ago, and I'm pretty sure it still is. But it's a most magnificent room. It's the room occupied by the head of the College of Music, and it's a room to die for. It has a 17th century carved fireplace. Strubenhome was one of the people who made a lot of money in the gold mines. That was his Cape Town home. He had it properly fitted out, and the room in which it is a really fitting place for that bookcase. But just on these, Mrs. Niven and the A. Bailey Centre. Lawyers in turmoil, academics are often in turmoil. The A. Bailey Centre was set up in a particular way to make sure that two warring professors couldn't get their hands on it in the 1960s. They've long since gone. One of them, in her 90s, is still alive, but that was the reason for the way in which it was structured, not as a university department, which it ordinarily would have been, but it was the only way in which the late Professor Batson's influence could be avoided. The second, before I finish, the second promotion, if I may, is about the Legacy Society. The Legacy Society exists to try to persuade those of us who have a strong affinity with UCT to make provision for UCT in our wills. And there are people here today who are members of the Legacy Society. There are people who are not. We just do hope that you will do so. I've been privileged during the last week to take people around the campus and see what is going on. And if you do get the opportunity to visit UCT, the state of the campus is absolutely tip-top. The number of fantastic buildings that have been put up in the last 2 decades on this campus is just so impressive. The most recent one is the Plattner Institute of Design, but the rebuilding of the new Science Lecture Theatre, as many of you may remember it, which was new in 1948, which was a very odd building with a dreadful lecture theatre, is now a state-of-the-art 6-story building. It is just wonderful. And there are many, many other examples. So we talked about legacy and the like. There are many things about UCT which are deserving of our legacy contributions. And so I do appeal to everybody to think about how you can leave something to endure UCT, not into the next century, but into the century after, which is what it deserves. So thank you, Owen, for a wonderfully interesting, erudite and witty lecture, and for all the insights that you've given us about this forgotten trees and trials, which from now on will be an unforgotten trees and trials. Thank you, Owen.